going to talk about AI and the question, can machines learn morality? And I'm quite sure we're also going to touch the point of if we actually want machines to do that or not, and what morality actually is. And I would like to introduce my panelists today. And we start with André Loesekrug-Pietri. He is from the best name ever, the JEDI initiative, which is Joint European Disruptive Initiative, which is, like, again, great name. We have Professor Dr. Sarah Spiekermann from the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and Professor Dr. Aimee from Wynsberghe at the University of Bonn, and she's head of the Foundation of Responsible Robotics. A warm welcome. So, before we start our conversation, I'd firstly mention that obviously you can always ask questions, and please use the Slido tool that you know already, and that you can send your questions here to us on stage. And before we come into the discussion, I would like to share two questions that our initiative partner Cive has asked the public beforehand. And those two questions were, is artificial intelligence, from your opinion, actually able to develop a conscience in future? And the answer in that question was no. 55% said no, which I thought was quite interesting. And we also asked different questions, and which is that you think that artificial intelligence will be able to solve complex problems in the society. And there again, it was quite negative. We say 65%, round about 65% also said no here. So before we start with the question, can machine learn morality and what a morality actually is, I would like to ask you, Mr. Spiekermann, does this answer surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all, but the share is quite interesting. It's still interesting to see that 45% of the people asked do believe that machines will develop consciousness. And I find this surprising, because I wouldn't see how this could be possible. But obviously, a lot of science fiction literature and a lot of media coverage in these past years has led to at least convincing 45% that that's possible.
Okay, interesting. Mr. Loesekrug-Pietri, do you agree with that?
Well, I would rather have answered 45%, so that's my take, but probably on a very long term, and for a very simple reason: is still today we don't exactly know what means conscience. So it's very difficult, obviously, to totally disregard the capacity, probably not in the cognitive linear way that we are thinking of. I mean, we should always remember that we as human beings are pretty linear in our thinking, and think only about the 2 last years of pandemic, how we are surprised by exponential curves, which are totally not the way we learn. And today, science and technology is advancing at exponential rates. So we cannot disregard that maybe in the future there will be something like that.
Okay, interesting. And we're going to come back to this point. Mrs. von Wynsberghe, let's start with the question, and I think this is very, very, very necessary to do that. When we talk about machines, there is a gazillion machines out there. There is a smartphone, there's a washing machine, there is aeroplanes, and there's drones and all of that. What kind of machines are we actually talking about?
Well, when you were introducing the panel, we did say artificial intelligence. So I imagine we're talking about machines that have a certain kind of software embedded within the artifact. But then, of course, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, there's a variety of methodologies. And good old-fashioned, the older sort of artificial intelligence methodologies are not necessarily as problematic as the newer ones. So oftentimes when we hear people talking about the black box, right, that we don't understand the rules that have been generated by the algorithm, this is a particular kind of methodology under the umbrella of AI. So this is machine learning or deep learning or neural networks. So it is important to clarify, yes, what kind of machines we're talking about, that we're really talking about the software embedded into the machine, and that we're talking about a particular kind of AI, at least. So I don't want to speak for Sarah and André, but I think the majority of our conversations will revolve around machine learning.
So interesting. I think you both agree. I saw you both nodding. But there is. I'm just asking toasters because I've heard in China there is toasters that do have artificial intelligence. I don't know for what purpose, and we probably never find out. But this is why important. Why we're talking about what kind of machines we're talking. Mr. Speaker,
and those wouldn't be, sorry to interrupt, but the toasters wouldn't necessarily be machine learning algorithms, right? And whether or not it's AI could also be debatable. I mean, perhaps it's just automation, but it would be very rare to think that the toaster required a machine learning algorithm in order to function.
Yeah, for sure. Especially if you talk about the question, and maybe that leads us to the next question, why a bread needed more than just roasting? So why would it need artificial intelligence? So, Mr. Spiekermann, let's talk about the question morality. Before we get into the questions why a machine would actually need to learn morality, what is morality for you?
Well, the question of what morality is has changed over the course of philosophy's development over the last 2,500 years. And originally, as the pre-modern form of morality was all about virtues. Yeah, just and honest and courageous and wise. This is the pre-modern conception of morality. And then in the about 500 years ago, with the start of what we call modernity, we had a shift away a little bit from this virtue ethical thinking and said perhaps we can have rules about what is moral and what is not. For instance, a utilitarian calculus that we now see an attempt to be embedded in autonomous cars, weighing pros and cons about things, or duty ethics where we have certain principles, the Kantian duties, where we think a machine should have certain duties. So these are the two conceptions. And in recent times, the last 10 years, I would say, both in economics and in philosophy, we have a reshift to the pre-modern conception of morality, which is virtue ethics.
So ethics, morality, that's like supposed to be like the most human ever. Mr. Loesekrug-Pietri, why would we have to imply that on machines at all anyway? Why would that be necessary? Can I ask you a question before you answer that? Did you take the name JEDI first and then make a name around it, or did you make a name and then call it JEDI?
That's very intriguing about the name, right? Well, look, first, it's the attempt to show that everything that comes out of Europe does not need to have a horrible acronym, so that people that speaks to it. And obviously, we're a little bit on the right side, so call that moral or call that ethicists. But we believe, morals is about what is right and what is wrong, as Sarah just mentioned. So we think machines are neutral, and it's what people do with it that makes a difference. And that's probably the answer to your question, is for thousands of years, the person who was doing and the one who was thinking about morality was the same. Today, we have machines which are often an artifact of somebody who is commanding them, or the developer who developed the software that Aimee talked about. And that's where it becomes very difficult, because we obviously have a split of responsibilities, and this is what makes it so complicated. Just maybe one word on the previous question. I think the morality aspect is obviously about right or wrong or virtues. The ethics part has this, even if these words are interchangeable, has this component that there is a code of ethic that a community, a group of peers is imposing on you. So I would prefer the term ethics, because that shows also that human beings remain in control, and that there's no sort of fatality that we need to have machines basically embedded with conscience.
The ethics questions, maybe I'll take that. I'll take that up front because you've just mentioned it. Ethics is something that comes up in a society. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Comes up in a society as a matter of history, as a matter of culture, religion, whatever, and that also differs throughout the world. Let's say, really, or real. So. So why would you think, maybe to ask you, Mr. Loesekrug-Pietri, the same question again, when we talk about ethics, do we need to make sure that when we talk about it that there are differences, or are we talking about a general robotics ethics?
Well, I want to remind that 70 years ago, Asimov edicted, together with one of his colleagues, edicted the famous Asimov laws. And I come back to the toaster. At that time, machines, or what we call today AI, were only androids, so roboters. And the three rules were very simple. Do not harm. Point number one. Rule number two is obey your master, so the human being behind it, without contradicting rule one. And the rule three was protect yourself, except do no harm, and obey your masters. And when you think about it, these are very simple rules which still today should prevail in a lot of the software that is being developed, and that probably should be top of the screen of all the developers doing machine learning or other sophisticated stuff.
Mr. von Wynsberghe, I would definitely ask you the same question, and because of that, what I've just heard is should be, doesn't exist any, it is. Do you know what I mean? Mrs. von Wynsberghe?
Yeah. So, but if I could just follow up, I think it's great that you brought up Asimov, but what is fantastic about his stories is that he showed that the laws don't work. Right? Like all of the stories were meant to say that ethics is way too difficult to encode in these set of laws. You need context, you need understanding in order to truly understand the ethics of your actions. So I think this is where we get to the crux of the situation. Are we talking about really programming ethics into a machine to create these artificial moral agents? Or are we just talking about the fact that there are values embedded in a machine? So I would also push back a little bit on André. He said that they have the starting point that technology is neutral, and it's how we use it that kind of determines whether or not it's right or wrong or good or bad. But I would actually say sort of the opposite. Technology is value laden. Every single decision that a designer makes based on a technology that they're making, do we use this training data or that training data? How many GPUs are we using to train? Do we measure carbon emissions? Do we not? Those are all value decisions. So the technology is a result of a whole set of value decisions, which means that these values become embedded into the technology. So this is another distinction that we have to talk about. Are we talking about machines having values embedded in them, being safe, being secure? Or are we talking about the machine being capable of doing ethical reasoning? For the second one, is a machine capable of ethical reasoning? I say absolutely not. It's a complete misunderstanding of what ethics is. And then to go back to the should, no, of course, we also shouldn't be programming machines to be thinking in this way.
Mm-hmm. What I find interesting about what you just said, we had the same discussion about hammers, or we just take like a hammer. Usually this example can be used as a tool, can be used as a weapon. And now we take this into the machine world and we basically ask the same question. Meanwhile, I honestly find my perspective that we haven't found a solution yet for the hammer problem. So why would we find one for machines?
Okay, so the hammer problem, then this goes back to what Sarah was talking about. This is an Aristotelian, right? This is, centuries ago that the hammer was used as an example to discuss this kind of issue. But I think now, so let's bracket the hammer, but when we look at what's happening in the AI space, there are many activists, academics, and technologists who are saying that there's a problem with the kind of training data that we use to actually generate the model. Right? So there are biases and stereotypes that are found in the cultures that we live in. This is embedded into the data that we have of this culture, and this data is then used to train the machine, right? So this is something that's different from the hammer. This is essentially a different kind of machine, and we have to acknowledge that we need to evaluate it in a different way. We can't say necessarily that all technologies are the same. At least that's what I would say. But I imagine, Sarah is also an expert in this field of values embedded in technology. So I would be curious to hear what Sarah said too.
Please.
Yeah, every technology is deeply contextual. If you take Facebook, for instance, it makes a difference of whether, or Instagram, is a case. It makes a difference of whether somebody posts the photos about beautiful bodies so that young teenage girls fall into depression, or whether somebody posts photos about their latest cooking recipes. Yeah, so it is the same platform like Instagram or Facebook, but depending on the context of what's being talked about, there can be very completely different ethical impacts. One being very a serious one, like the Frances Haugen case has shown, and then in the other one where it's cooking, you might think, oh no, there is no ethical issue. But what about if somebody suggests a poisonous dish? So what I want to say with this is that our technology and even one single platform can offer us, let's say, thousands of different opportunities of being in an ethical situation. And how can machines handle that? And if they are to handle that in an ethical manner, they need to be built, just as Aimee has said it, from the start, envisioning such potential areas of conflict. And they need to be tailored and twisted in detail so that in the appropriate situation, they will behave ethically. And that is so complex that I'm wondering whether any company would ever want to invest in it.
There is a good question actually, but because there is actually a question from the audience saying that there has recent studies shown that in the US corporate culture is actually basically, if I get this right, is buying into AI research. But I do want to come to this point before, but there's another question that I want to ask you, to you, Mr. Loesekrug-Pietri, because we're talking about like actually machines having values. The question is, and I think it's a good point, is can machines actually understand? Because I guess understanding becomes for making a suggestion for anything, I guess.
Yes, and since this conference is called Europe 2022, this would be a call for action. I mean, this whole topic of the black box, which explains a lot of the discussion we have today, the explainability of AI, which often people, because they have not gone so deep enough into the topic, say it's not explainable. No, if you really do the effort, even very convoluted neural networks with a lot of layers, etc., that actually mimic a little bit how our brain works, can be explained. But that just takes time. And this is a fantastic area of research. And what personally worries me is that those who are currently working on it is our US equivalent, which is called DARPA, or the big platforms. And I don't want tomorrow that the big platforms that today have done a lot of harm become the Ministry of Truth, because they will be able, unlike the others, to explain if an AI is biased or not. So this is absolutely a fundamental point. And if you may just make a remark on the previous discussion, actually, I fully agree with what Sarah and Aimee has said. Let's just not make the misunderstanding. In the hammer is not a technology. The steel is the technology. Facebook is not the technology. It's the machine learning that we mentioned before, or deep neural networks, who are the technology. The way, the data set you use, that's then the product. And indeed, the product will depend entirely on the ethics of the programmer. What I just wanted to say with the Asimov laws is, if we already had the Asimov laws, we would not have Facebook today, because Facebook's algorithms are reinforced when engagement comes in front of nudity or disinformation or conspiracy theories. And incredibly, Europe, who has that as values and has recognized that first, is losing the opportunity to actually turn that into a competitive advantage. And today I'm flabbergasted that it's Apple who is actually, because they're changing their tracking devices, that is actually showing that they can get privacy right.
Ms. von Wynsberghe, I can see you want to say something to that.
Yeah, so going back to Asimov, and when you said, if we had started with Asimov's laws, we would have trained, the machine learning models at Facebook to be able to detect nudity and whatnot. But again, we go back to this problem of contextualization. right? Because there are families, there are parents who would send a picture of their kids to the grandparents and they're in the bathtub, right? And so this is a very different context from a situation where it is a problematic, legally challenging situation that we have to deal with. So I only say that to say that it's not black and white, that it's very difficult. So I don't know if using Asimov's laws.
I fully agree with you. I mean,
yeah.
Of course we are trying
I hear what you're saying though. There should be something like, what are the limits that we can create to protect people? So I see what you're saying, and the problem is that it's so complicated. But I was also going to go back to something else that you were talking about, explainable AI and the issue of explainability. And this is, I think, a perfect example for also reiterating this distinction that I was talking about before, that we're not necessarily talking about artificial moral agents, right? To make a machine learning algorithm explainable does not mean we're making it moral, right? This is a value that we are embedding into the machine. So again, going back to this distinction, but then also I'm just now starting to learn how complex and difficult this whole area of explainability is, because we're working with a team who is using machine learning to identify areas of wilderness and areas of rural areas, right? Using satellite images, they've already trained their algorithm. Now they're putting new images in. They're also doing this in an explainable way. And the machine is telling them these certain areas that the machine would classify as wilderness, but it turns out that it's an airport runway. Right? So the machine is explaining, the pixels that it used in order to determine its prediction. But now the humans are sitting there going, what? I have no idea why. So it's interesting. It's almost like explainable AI is seen as this, okay, that's going to solve the problem of the black box, but then we've just opened another black box. Now what? Now what do we do?
But that's exactly one question that we also gotten from the audience. And the question is, where do you see, because the problem that you just shown is what I call a misunderstanding. And then the question is, an ethical misunderstanding would obviously be a lot worse than just the question if it's a runway or a wilderness. And the question is, where do you see the chances to prevent ethical misunderstandings?
So if you're asking me, but I know it's probably not my turn to talk, but if you're asking me, it means that we abandon this idea of having artificial moral agents. It means we stop with the rhetoric of we are making these machines to be ethical. It's dangerous. It runs the risk of exploiting human psychological tendencies. I say instead we focus on these are the values, the procedural values, so that we can establish procedural trust in the technologies, that they will be reliable and work according to a certain system of values.
I think everyone agrees with you, Mrs. Spiekermann.
Yeah, I think machines simply don't have access to meaning. They don't have really access to relevance except for past statistics, And as we just heard, we want to get out of linear thinking and presuming that past data will tell us what's relevant in the future. Human beings have something which is connecting with the world. It's a part of our intelligence, what's called nous. It's not rational calculus. It's a building up of a connection, resonance with the world that allows us to make ethical judgments. And for that reason, I also share in what Aimee just said. We shouldn't waste our funds in trying to build machines that are not able to live up to fill this gap, but instead perhaps train dialogue systems to work with humans, to talk and learn about ethics. We could have speech assistants and agents, that help us humans take ethical decisions by knowing more about the arguments that are around. Also, this is something where machines are very good. They have a lot of access to knowledge and can help us in finding our own way around. And I think that's a better way to think about moral agents. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But then let's come back. If we kind of do agree on the fact that, or you agree on the fact that it's not good for basically machines to learn morality, yes? Please nod if you say okay. So, but we've just heard, and there's the question, and Mr. Loesekrug-Pietri did not, maybe because you didn't want to, or because you have a different opinion. Tell me, because the question is, so there is US companies are obviously investing in it, Chinese companies to a degree where we can actually look into them, and obviously there is a lot more that we can't look into, is doing it. Wouldn't it be, maybe bring that to the point, wouldn't it be good for the European Union to have an ethical machine, or a machine that has some sort of morality, because it's our morality? Mr. Loesekrug-Pietri.
Yeah, and I want to connect that and completely support what Sarah has just said. I mean, you spoke, Sarah, about the fact that we should not waste money. First, this concept of artificial intelligence, I rather prefer the concept at the stage of technology where we are today of augmented intelligence. I mean, I spoke about exponential before. Let's face it, we have entered for the smarter of us, probably later, for the rest of us, and the vast majority, probably a couple of years already, in a moment where we cannot understand the complexity of the world anymore. Look at just what happened in the last 2 years, the number of papers, of information, and look at how it took politicians, societies by storm. That's where probably machines can help us focus on the moral questions, the intuitions that Sarah very eloquently described. And so take away part of our work, which is, or intellectual work, which is concentrated on just gathering data, having relevant data points, etc. And that's probably the smart way, which I think is an opportunity for the Europeans, because then they would also have full spectrum to develop their own humanistic values. Indeed, I'm concerned to see that some societies, and including the societies, unfortunately, this whole Silicon Valley environment, where there is this techno push, this. I mean, we speak a little bit less about the singularity point, a point where general intelligence will be reached, but still there is this obsession that machines will replace us. I think we need to work much more in this coordination, this interfacing, and also look, who is Europe? I mean, this dream of having a unified Europe where we all look alike is first dangerous and never going to happen. But where this diversity, which will help us understand the problems of the world probably a bit better, that can be combined with a powerful, so it's not a naive way of seeing things, it's just a way for the Europeans to really play and defend their values. Otherwise, we will spend our time on discussions, and the others will impose their vision of the world, which I think we don't want. You both want
to say to that, and I do want to stretch one more point, because this is why I'm both asking you not to maybe have it a bit short, and then I come to a different point. And we start with you, Mr. Spiekermann.
Yeah, I think it would actually be quite good if China and the US was focusing all its money on the singularity, whilst we in Europe really build good machines. I think that would be very good. So have them waste and throw their money away. And we should do something which is called value-based engineering. And value-based engineering means, what Aimee started to explain, is that in the process of building machines, we look at the value potentials that those machines have. Not only negative ones, privacy, security, and all of that, but also positive ones where machines can support us in a way that we haven't used them so far, for beauty, for truth, for friendship, and so on. Yeah, instead of just connecting people and building some dumb functionality that screws us all up. So we should be thinking about values and then build them step by step into the machine. And then we have better machines, and we'll be very competitive, especially if our competitors throw their money into something else, which won't work.
Mrs. van Wynsberghe.
That was wonderful, Sarah. So I agree. Let's have them throw their money into the singularity, and then we can focus on value-based engineering. I would push back on, I'm still not convinced that we should have these systems acting as our friends or our social companions. I think these systems should help us create friendships among the human population, because I think no machine can truly be a friend. But then if I can just add another value in, that is something that is under discussed, and that's sustainability. So one thing that we're not talking about is the fact that there are environmental impacts to all of these machines that we're talking about. Carbon emissions, the mining of minerals, electronic waste, water usage, land usage, right? So we are running full speed to use AI, to create AI in whatever way we think we should be doing, without having any regulation that requires the measurement of these environmental impacts at the very beginning throughout the usage.
There was someone else who wants to say something. Go for it. Mr. Loesekrug-Pietri, I can see you not fully agreeing with this.
No, actually, I agree, because, I mean, you know, that was not the point of introducing ourselves, but, you know, we launch challenges to solve some of the world's biggest problems, and we think that Europe needs to be purpose-driven and not do tech for tech. And one of our challenges, exactly what Aimee just mentioned, is can we reduce by a factor of X the energy that is needed for that? Can we do you know, semiconductors without the critical raw materials? Because otherwise we think by using these digital tools that we are sustainable, but actually we are not. So that's also an economic, but also societal.
Yeah, that could be Europe's competitive advantage, right? If we are the ones who are leading in the sustainable development.
Very good point, Mr. Spiekermann, and then I get to ask a question as well.
Yeah, actually, you are, Aimee, pointing to a dilemma, which is, on the one hand side, we'll be getting better at making machines nicer to be with. Yeah, we can have robots that are polite, finally, with us, you know. And in China, their politeness will be different than in Europe, perhaps. And we can make them now more emotional, yeah, responsive to our emotional concerns. But the problem is that by building machines so well and so addictively, we are actually driving humanity into the virtual, which is exactly what we don't want from an environmental perspective. But also, if you consider not only natural sustainability, but human sustainability, yeah, who are we in 30 years if our children grow up in VR and in Meta? Will they still be humans as we are? And that's a danger. So we are at a crossing point, whether we go down the paradise, yeah, Apple, way, and in the end lose ourselves and our nature.
Mm-hmm. So this is a very great discussion, and I definitely want to go on this point, but we have to talk a little bit about something that is no fun for most people, and it's called regulations. And Mr. Loesekrug-Pietri, maybe because, you know, you're an initiative from the European Union, you're very close to this, and there was actually also a question in the audience. The Commission has proposed regulations on artificial intelligence, and there is a huge discussion about it as well. Do you feel like those regulations are actually helping us to have value-driven machines built in the European Union, or is it hindering innovations?
Just to make things clear, we are an initiative from the civil society. So we are around 5,000 academics, researchers, deep tech startups from all over Europe. And we do it as a foundation because we believe that, unfortunately, the public hand today, at least in Europe and in European member states, has lost two things, which is critical today. This capacity of thinking long-term, and I will come back to your question specifically on that, and the agility. And what we see, unfortunately, is that it's authoritarian states which have these combination of the two, and we as democracies should not say we should become more authoritarian. That's the wrong answer. The better answer is how do we make our democracies fit for the 21st century? And to come back on this regulation part, what we need is to give a vision, is to anticipate. If we are permanently running behind, and today we will have the semiconductors strategy presented, if we are running behind what is happening in Beijing or Palo Alto all the time, like we are today, We are going to do reusable launchers. We are going to do semiconductors like TSMC is doing in 5 years. We will be always late in the world where there is a first mover advantage. And if we want our values to be there and strong, we need to embed them first. And that's why my point on Apple and privacy drives me a bit nuts, is that we envisioned sustainability 40 years ago. 99% of panels are today made in China and 65% of batteries already. So where is the agility of the Europeans? And the same thing should apply to AI. AI is an opportunity to demultiply our capacities as human beings, remain strong and even reinforce our values. And that's my point about, getting rid of, I would say, the material aspect and focusing on what makes us humans. We should make sure that the regulation are mainly regulation that can lead the way for the next 5, 10, 15 years.
So when you say that, you're also saying that the regulations that are proposed now are hindering, right?
I'm not saying they're hindering, but I'm saying a regulation that don't try to make scenario planning, anticipate what might come and what technology tools we will have at our disposal in 5 or 10 years it's a moving target. So the risk is that we will obviously shoot next to it. So we need to experiment because nobody knows, obviously.
And are we there yet? Or do we need to get there?
We need to be much better. One of the objectives of the president of the commission, and I think she was completely right, Ursula von der Leyen, when she took her helm 2 years ago, she wanted to have a very, very strong anticipation capability. Unfortunately, this is an entity at the EU Commission that it's still, and probably it needs to be not a centralized department, and that I'm talking about regulation and structures here. It needs to be much more bottom up and taking the agility of academics, of great people like we have on this panel. I'm talking about Aimee and Sarah, obviously. And we are too much doing committees and internal work.
We are too much European Union. What you like,
I'm
basically.
Talking about the European Union, unfortunately, I see exactly the same in the member states.
I want to come to you. We have 3 minutes left. When I say we are to European Union, that means obviously we have a government that sometimes appears to be super slow. Mrs. Spiekermann first, and then Mrs. von Wynsberghe.
If we look at what the GDPR has led to in Europe and worldwide in terms of how companies today think about personal data processing, it has had a great impact. It has really changed architecture. And it's not sometimes well interpreted yet, as we see in the informed consent debates. How shall we nudge people into giving their data, which is being done right now? And that shows that laws alone, even though they can have great impulses, will not lead to an ethical computing environment. For that, we need an ethical mindset. We need a value-driven mindset. We need to go away from functionality and profit. And the IT industry today is still driven mainly, most of the players, by functionality and profit. And that cannot be the future. And the only company that's the most valuable on earth, by the way, that I think has understood that is Apple. Because they started out with beauty. They started out with a different value proposition than Bill Gates did. And today they have really are there taking privacy serious. And that's the kind of attitude that we need in the IT industry in a much wider form in Europe if we want to be competitive on the basis of our what we call values.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go to you, Mrs. von Wynsberghe, and I'm basically asking you to maybe, with your answer, you can also answer 2 questions that came considering the UN Convention on Human Rights. And because now we've heard there should be values and how we control GDPR was definitely a good point. Maybe you can mix it up a little bit with the idea to not just have a European Union idea of it, but more a UN perspective. I know it's tricky. Sorry.
And I have 1 minute.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add to Sarah's. So the Apple point is interesting, but I think it's also fascinating that now Apple is so large. It's almost a luxury position to be in, that they get to now focus their attention to privacy. Think about the smaller startups who don't have that kind of money and who are struggling, or other countries who didn't have the freedom to collect data at will, and now they're kind of sitting there like, well, how am I supposed to have an AI infrastructure? Okay, so then in talking about, is regulation inhibiting or is it helping us? I would say the current AI Act, as it is proposed, it does nothing in terms of environmental sustainability. So I think they are on the right track in terms of protecting the European values. I was a member of the high-level expert group on AI, so full disclosure, I am a big fan of the AI Act because it comes from some of the work that we did there, but there's nothing in there about environmental sustainability. And so what I would say is, in order for Europe to be the front runner in terms of environmental sustainability, it should be regulated. It should be something where companies are obliged to do this, because if it's voluntary, it's too expensive for companies to be able to do this. Yeah. And so this is how we find incentives to fund the small startups to do this kind of research. So it's actually a hindrance that the regulation does not have anything about environmental sustainability. So like a weird shift there. Then moving from micro to macro, should we be looking at the United Nations framework rather than a European framework? So the UNESCO has just published ethical guidelines, and when I read those, I see that there is quite a push to sort of encourage the use of AI rather than a dialogue and a discussion on how do we tamper our consumption? How do we actually start to lower consumption and enthusiasm for the technology? And I think this is what happens when you have so many different players involved. You have to water down certain language so that you get this country to approve. You have to increase language of this way so that you get that country to approve. I think what is beautiful about Europe, about the European Commission, is that we all share a body of values. We're liberal democratic societies. And so it makes it easier for us to have a unified stance and to be able to promote that in regulation.
Perfect. Perfect finish for this conversation, for this panel. Thank you very much. I guess everyone heard, and we definitely heard, we're not at the end yet of this discussion. The discussion is still going on. It will probably be going on for years, maybe decades, because obviously there is new developments in technology. There will be new machines. Maybe we do have a very smart toaster at some stage. We'll see. If not, then it's also okay, because it's still going to be brown bread. Okay, thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you for the discussion, and see you next time.